afternoon. I'm Michelle Dallafor, Senior Vice President for Tax and Budget Policy at First Focus on Children. Welcome to today's webinar series on kids and COVID. For those of you who are new to First Focus, we are a bipartisan child advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring that children are a priority in federal budget and policy decisions. Today's discussion is part of a multi-week conversation series that First Focus is hosting to mark the second anniversary already of the World Health Organization declaring the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic, and to examine the wide-ranging consequences for children. Our series covers many topics, including the pandemic's impact on children's physical and mental health, child and youth homelessness, child welfare, mixed status families, and more. You can watch previous panels and sign up for upcoming sessions by visiting firstfocus.org. Today's conversation will focus on the economic impacts of the pandemic. Sadly, the pandemic and its economic fallout disrupted nearly every aspect of children's lives. But due to the hard work of advocates, our champions in Congress, and President Biden's leadership, 2021 was a landmark year for investing in children and reducing child poverty in the United States. The American Rescue Plan, passed in March of 2021, authorized much needed and long overdue investments in childcare, education, child nutrition, healthcare, housing, income support, such as the child tax credit, and more, and reversed years of a downward spending trend on children's programs and services. By our analysis at First Focus, the share of federal spending dedicated to children increased from a record low of 7.6% in 2020 to nearly 11.2% in 2021, an unprecedented increase. And we know these temporary investments and policy changes work to reduce child poverty significantly, as overall families spent the cash benefits on basic household needs without reducing their employment. Analysis by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities shows that 91% of households with incomes below $35,000 spent their child tax credit payments, for example, on food, utilities, housing, clothing, and education costs. One-year improvements to the child tax credit alone reduced monthly child poverty by close to 30%. And the CTC payments promised an outsized impact on reducing poverty for Black and Hispanic children, many of whom were previously ineligible for the full credit. As the CTC payments expired this January, child poverty rates surged. In just 1 month, nearly 3.7 million children, including 662,000 Black children and 1.3 million Latino children, fell below the poverty line. Reinstating these payments would also help families deal with pandemic-related spikes in the cost of goods like gas and food, and longer-term increases in expenses like childcare. The pandemic-fueled inflation is compounding a longer-term trend. The cost of raising children has been rising faster than inflation for decades. A 2019 landmark study from the National Academy of Sciences confirmed that cash assistance reduces child poverty and improves children's long-term health, educational, and economic outcomes. And a growing body of research and personal stories confirm that the temporary American Rescue Plan investments in cash benefits also absolutely had a positive impact for tens of millions of households with children. So despite some frustration with some of our lawmakers, we must collectively continue to urge Congress not to cut children out of legislation investing in our nation's families and economy. The House-passed Build Back Better bill is a kids' bill, and let's work to remind our congressional leaders of that and the importance in investing in our children. So again, today we will hear about the impact of some of the income supports authorized under the American Rescue Plan and how they help to reduce material hardship, support children, youth, caregivers, and families, and significantly cut our child poverty rate. Unfortunately, the recovery has been uneven, and we also will hear about racial and gender inequities during our country's period of recovery. The research and initiatives we'll hear about today that support transformational policy changes and investments to benefit our children are essential to help make a strong case for lawmakers to prioritize children in their everyday decision-making. Before I introduce our expert panelists, we now turn to recorded remarks by the senior senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Bob Casey. Senator Casey is a longtime champion of children in the United States Senate who has worked tirelessly to prioritize children and youth in federal policy and budget decisions, particularly fighting to reduce child poverty and elevating the unique needs of children during this pandemic and long before it. We need more champions for children like Senator Casey in the United States Senate, and we are pleased to share his remarks with you.
Let me start by thanking First Focus on Children for convening the Kids and COVID event series, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. We know that conversations like these are important as we work to permanently address the inequalities facing children all across our country. The American Rescue Plan was a critical first step, and it included important investments in children and families, including an enhanced earned income tax credit, an enhanced child tax credit, and an enhanced child care tax credit. The expanded child tax credit alone reduced child poverty by 40%. That meant that in a state like Pennsylvania, the families of 2.2 million children benefited from this credit. We also expanded the earned income tax credit to $1,500 for some of the most at-risk youth populations, former foster youth, and young people experiencing homelessness. This reform makes these at-risk youth eligible for the credit right at age 18, unlocking access to a critical lifeline of support. Across the nation, families and their budgets have been squeezed like never before, squeezed by the cost of groceries, gas, and so many other household items, as those numbers go way up for all of those costs. But families who paid for childcare in 2021 will receive thousands of dollars back after they file their taxes this month. Many families have used a version of the child care tax credit before, but the American Rescue Plan made changes to help working families affected by the financial burdens of the pandemic. Now, in this enhanced version, available just this year, families can receive up to $8,000 to help cover childcare expenses and offset rising costs. We must also, as we move forward, increase access to early childhood learning programs and raise the wages of childcare workers and educators. Affordable, high-quality early learning gives children the strong start they need to develop and succeed in school. When children learn more now, they will earn more later. We know that. That's why I'm proud to co-sponsor the Child Care for Working Families Act, which would do the following: cap child care costs for working families. Second, support universal access to high-quality pre-K programs for all 3- and 4-year-olds. And third, it would ensure that all child care workers are paid living wages. I've also outlined my 5 freedoms for America's children, which is a comprehensive proposal to secure the blessings of freedom for children today and tomorrow. This proposal identifies 5 freedoms that we must guarantee for children, all children throughout the United States of America. First, the freedom to be healthy. Second, the freedom to be economically secure. Third, the freedom to learn. Fourth, the freedom from hunger. And fifth, the freedom to be safe from harm. As part of the Freedom to Learn proposal, I've called for an additional $25 billion annually to expand affordable childcare, early learning programs, Head Start, as well as a permanent expansion of the child care tax credit. Now, I know we have a long way to go to get all this done, but we must begin this journey. And I believe that when we're talking about our kids, when it comes to the children of America, we have to dream big and shoot high in order to make progress for our kids and for our country. So thanks very much for this opportunity to speak to you today, and I'm grateful for this series. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. It's always good to hear from Senator Casey. Now I'm delighted to introduce our excellent panelists and partners to talk about some of their work on the economic impacts of the pandemic. Thank you all so much for participating today. First, Patrick Cooney is the Assistant Director of Economic Mobility with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan. He is the lead author of the recently released paper, Material Hardship and Mental Health Following the COVID-19 Relief Bill and American Rescue Plan Act. Patrick also oversees the Partnership on Economic Mobility between the University of Michigan and the City of Detroit. Joining him is Sam Jubaid, who is a data and policy analyst, also with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan, working primarily with the Detroit Partnership for Economic Mobility. In addition, we have Julie Votman. She is the Director of Job Quality and Senior Counsel for the National Women's Law Center. She works on a range of issues involving job quality and supports for low-income women and their families, including minimum wage and overtime pay, fair scheduling policies, and childcare assistance. We also have Anna Johnson with us, who is the Associate Director of Housing and Health for the John Burton Advocates for Youth. Previously, Anna has focused on reducing over-medication and hyper-incarceration of youth and improving access to community and therapeutic services. Anna works with young adults and current youth in care to ensure their voices influence policies that affect them. And very delighted to have Emerald Evans with us, who is a student at California State University, Sacramento. Her goal is to obtain her Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Justice, then proceed to law school to pursue her JD. Emerald has experienced foster care and extended foster care and has a passion to work for youth on behalf of those who have experienced the same. A quick note before I turn to our panelists, we are planning to take questions after our conversation with them. So if you're watching in our closed door session, you can submit a question using the chat on your right. If you're tuning in on our website or one of our social media channels, you can participate in the live conversation by using the hashtag #KidsInCovid. Post your tweets with the hashtag to submit a question. I thank everybody for tuning in today. And again, I certainly thank all of our panelists for their participation. And I will turn the virtual floor over to Patrick and Sam. Thank you.
Sorry, is that better? You guys hear me now?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah, I will. Yeah, Pat is having some technical difficulties, so I will take it away. Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be with you all today. My name is Sam Jubaid. I'm the data and policy analyst at the Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan, and I'm joined by Pat Cooney, who is the assistant director for policy impact at Poverty Solutions. So real quick, for those who are not familiar with Poverty Solutions, we are a university-wide initiative at U of M that is focused on conducting action-based research to inform efforts to prevent and alleviate poverty in Michigan and across the country. And we're here today to talk about the research we've taken on over the past 2 years, charting rates of material hardship and indicators of financial well-being among US households focusing particularly on US households with children, assessing the success of the pandemic safety net that was first directed by federal lawmakers in March of 2020. So in March of 2020, when businesses and schools began to shut down and millions of Americans lost work, we, like everyone else, were deeply concerned about the financial well-being of US households. In the months after the CARES Act was passed, we dug into the data looking at rates of material hardship gathered from the Household Pulse Survey, which is deployed bi-weekly during the pandemic by the US Census Bureau, as well as other indicators of financial well-being. These rates of material hardship are an incredibly important indicator because they are based on survey questions that ask households directly about scarcity. Do you have enough to eat in the home? Did you pay your rent, etc.? And we've looked at these indicators repeatedly over the past 2 years. And time and again, a fairly simple story has emerged. When the government has deployed robust income supports, namely expanded UI and stimulus checks, material hardship falls. When action is delayed, namely in late 2020, when there was a long period of delayed action after the CARES Act, yet unemployment was still quite high, hardship rose considerably. But despite this delay, overall, we see robust government action placing the average US household in a better financial position in 2020 and throughout 2021 than in 2019. This is pretty incredible when you think about it. In the year and year after, more than 20 million people lost work. The average US household was better off than they were at the peak of a near decade-long recovery after the Great Recession. In the last brief we wrote, we focused on two central questions. First, despite the overall success of the pandemic safety net, throughout a stubborn gap in hardship rates had remained between households without children and households with children, with households with children experiencing far higher rates of material hardship than households without. In this last brief, we wanted to pay close attention to whether the implementation of the expanded child tax credit narrowed this gap. And in addition, we wanted to examine whether the gains households had made were durable in the face of inflation. By the end of 2021, we were already experiencing historic price increases. Had these increases cut into the gains households had made during the pandemic. Pat, you want to continue?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. You guys can hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Good. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. There we go. Thanks, Sam, for picking up there. So first, we found that the child tax credit payments did indeed narrow the gap in hardship rates between households with children and those without. So this chart is one that was from our last brief and that we replicated in briefs throughout the pandemic, showing food insufficiency rates from September 2020 to February 2022. And so what you can see here is the sort of shape of the pandemic recovery. Food insufficiency rises in late 2020 after there was a sort of delay in government relief. And then after the December relief package, you see food insufficiency drop for all households. And then after ARPA, it drops kind of considerably more. And then you see it kind of rise, kind of stabilize, rise back up a little bit. And then in July 2021, we see the first child tax credit payments go out. And so one thing you notice throughout is that there's while rates kind of rise and fall with the based on the generosity of federal relief, there's this stubborn gap that persists between households with children, which is that top line, and households without. And you can see that once those first payments go out, that gap narrows considerably. And if you can go ahead to the next slide, this kind of puts it into sharp relief. In the last brief, we actually looked at the ratio between hardship rates for those with children and those without. And so if you see that ratio decline, that means that the gap is narrowing. And sure enough, clear as day, when the CTC payments go out in July 2021, that ratio declines considerably, and it stays relatively stable and low through the January 2022 collection period, which happened prior to, it was like very early in the month, so prior to when families would have gotten their monthly payments. But of course, they expired in January, and then you see that ratio shoot up again. So we see kind of very clearly the impact of what happens when the child tax credit payments, the expanded child tax credit payments were in place, and then what happens when right away when they get removed. You can go ahead and do the next slide. All right, now Sam's going to dig into some of the numbers on how we checked some of this data against inflation using some JP Morgan Chase data, which Sam can walk you through.
Thanks, Pat. So the other question that we examined was, are the gains that we're seeing for households with children and low-income households durable in the face of rising prices? So we looked at, as Pat mentioned, we looked at data from the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which tracked checking account balances for thousands of households throughout the pandemic. And this was split by income quartiles. You had the lowest income quartile compared with the highest income quartile. And JPMC has been publishing on this data throughout the pandemic, and their data basically told the same story that our hardship data did, that buttressed by government relief, US households and low-income households in particular had bank balances well above what they were in 2019, throughout 2020 and into 2021. But that data was not adjusted for inflation. So that's exactly what we did in our brief. We found actually that even after adjusting for inflation, bank balances were still up compared to 2019. But specifically more for the lowest income quartile, where it was more than 50%. Another indicator that the end of 2021, average US households were in a better financial position than at the end of the post-Great Recession economic expansion. Can you go to the next slide? So here again, we can see the impact of the child tax credit payments. The red line in this graph shows the bank balances of CTC targeted families. So those are households with children in relation to the end of 2019. And the blue line shows that of those not receiving the CTC payments. So of course, those are households without children. So here we're seeing that households with children are receiving large spikes in their account balances throughout the pandemic. So they're receiving more in stimulus check payments, for instance. But that money is drawn down very quickly, which is reflecting in the higher costs of childcare. But then once child tax credit payments start hitting bank accounts, we're seeing the balances stabilize, even as inflation adjusted balances for households without children start to decline a bit.
You can go to the next slide. So yeah, so just to wrap up kind of the quick version of our brief here, basically we've written a number of times throughout the pandemic, and looking at this data for 2 years, we find that during the COVID-19 pandemic, a time in which the federal government essentially flipped the social safety net on its head from a system that was narrowly defined and means tested to one that was cash-based and nearly universal, we see financial well-being improve for the average US household, which is pretty extraordinary. And then following CTC payments, we also see the gap in hardship rates between households with children and those without decline considerably. And you pair that with some of the data that Michelle talked about at the outset around the declines in child income poverty that we see. And we also find that these gains were durable even against rising prices. So at the end of 2021, there was a lot of discussion about inflation is eating into these gains. We found that wasn't the case. All told, these concerns over rising prices have dominated the headlines, but we argue that whenever those discussions of rising prices and the concerns of rising prices need to be placed in conversation with the gains we've seen in low income households, looking at essentially that the discontinuation of CTC payments is a much more significant threat to the financial well-being of households with children, particularly amidst rising prices, and to put a fine point on it, they're probably even more necessary now because of rising prices. So we're going to stop there, and we'd be happy to answer questions at the end. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much. Very interesting and helpful. So Julie, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to you to add some more breadth and depth and talk about some of the issues you've been working on. So thank you again for participating.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me. Again, I'm Julie Boatman. I'm Director of Job Quality with the National Women's Law Center here in DC. Now, at the National Women's Law Center, we also have really been closely tracking economic indicators as you might expect from the title of our organization, focusing particularly on women's unemployment and labor force participation rates ever since the pandemic began. And we've been calling attention to higher rates of labor force participation exit, or higher rates of labor force exit for women, and a slower and more uneven jobs recovery for women of color. But we also know that these numbers don't tell the whole story. And especially in a moment where some indicators like unemployment rates for many groups are looking closer to where they were before the pandemic began, we wanted to go deeper into how women and their families are really faring in this pandemic economy. So that is where our qualitative and quantitative research comes in. Just to quickly review, working with Sprout Insight, we spoke with 35 women in December of last year in a combination of focus groups and one-on-one interviews, particularly focusing on Black women, Latinas, Asian American and Pacific Islander women, and women in low-paid jobs. And then just in February of 2022, we surveyed a total of 3,800 people with oversamples of those same populations, as well as an oversample of women who had lost or quit their jobs during the pandemic. You can go to the next slide. So we found that consistent with Patrick and Sam's research, as well as the statistics that Michelle reviewed, a lot of folks certainly benefited from the stimulus payments, the expanded child tax credit, and other really critical relief measures during the pandemic. You can see here how many people reported that they received these benefits, and both our qualitative and our quantitative research affirms that they were really a lifeline for a lot of people, that helped them afford essentials like food and housing and utilities and childcare. But we also know that these measures were not designed to address the really structural barriers to economic security that women, and particularly women of color, faced honestly long before the pandemic began. And again, we know that most of these benefits had expired by the end of last year. So when we surveyed people in February of 2022, we found that by many measures, women really hadn't even gotten back to where they were in February of 2020. And we know that that's a status quo that we really don't want to return to. So as a little background, we know that women, particularly women in low-paid jobs, Black women, Latinas, have borne the brunt of pandemic-related job losses, and that women, particularly white women and AAPI women, have been more likely to leave the labor force altogether during the pandemic. And we also know that over the past few months, men have fully recovered their pandemic-related labor force losses. There are about 500,000 more men in the labor force now than 2 years ago. But there were close to 1 million fewer women working in February 2022 than in February 2020. And our polling confirms that among women who lost or quit a job during the pandemic, only 42% of women have gotten a new job, compared to 2/3 of men. And the gap is even bigger for mothers versus fathers, as you can see on that slide. And we know childcare and ongoing I am so sorry. I think my notes hit mute for me. So I apologize that I don't know exactly when I went on mute, but I was explaining that we know that childcare and we know that childcare and ongoing disruptions to that care is playing a big role in continuing to keep women out of the labor force and making it harder for them to re-enter. So if you can go to the next slide, again, I'm so sorry about that. We found in our polling that nearly 1 in 5 moms and more than 1 in 4 mothers with children under 5 years old report that they stop working when their children are not in school or childcare. And that's compared to just 6% of fathers and 8% of fathers with children under 5. So it is really women who are taking on the lion's share of caregiving, especially when there are school and childcare disruptions. If you can go on to the next. And when we look at household finances, we found that 39% of women overall and much higher shares of women who lost or quit a job since February of 2020, as well as women in low paid jobs, say that their family's financial situation is worse today than before the pandemic. There were a lot of reasons for this, but women most often cited job loss, reduced hours, and needing to use up their savings. Black women and Latinas in particular also named falling behind on rent or mortgage payments as a cause of reduced financial security. And this might at first blush seem inconsistent with Patrick and Sam's findings. But again, we're looking at a point in time after the expanded child tax credit expired and many months after the last stimulus check, for example. There's also some level of subjectivity inherent in this sort of self-report where, folks are not answering the survey and checking their bank balances between February of 2022 and February of 2020, but they're at a moment where people are seeing prices rise and also seeing the promise of help disappear. And so there's a feeling of financial insecurity and instability that I think we also see reflected in these answers. It's also important to note, if you can go to the next slide, that for all we hear about labor shortages and rising wages, nearly half of currently employed women report that they are paid $15 an hour or less, along with 23% of employed men. And nearly 60% of women in these low-paid jobs report that they don't get any key benefits, no health insurance, no retirement benefits, no paid sick days, no paid family or medical leave, not even any paid vacation from their jobs. So with all that I've just laid out, perhaps it's not surprising, if you can go to the next slide, that in our poll, 58% of women overall, and including 75% of women who lost or quit a job during the pandemic, and 63% of women in low-paid jobs said that the pandemic had a negative impact on their mental health. And bills and expenses top the list of stressors for women, but health concerns and caregiving for children and older family members, as well as balancing work and caregiving, really loom large as well. And we know that when parents are stressed, children are stressed too. We weren't able to get into this too deeply in our survey, but it seems, again, pretty clear that the ongoing instability and uncertainty of the past 2 years and counting is taking a really big toll. And without policies in place to address that, we can expect to see ramifications for years to come. So there's so much more data that I don't have time to dig into here today, but I hope even these top lines help make clear that as critical as the American Rescue Plan Act and other relief was to help families and our economy through this unprecedented crisis, for a lot of families, this crisis really is not over. So the last point I want to emphasize is that we actually know what the policy solutions are that will create a real and equitable recovery that doesn't leave women and children behind and doesn't just bring us back to a broken pre-pandemic status quo. So we know we need high quality, affordable childcare and universal pre-K and paid leave and supports for home care and the expanded child tax credit. And we really can't let Congress or the administration give up on them. And our poll also shows that these policies are extremely popular. Strong majorities support all the policies we tested. There's a longer list even than the care infrastructure proposals on my last slide. And support was especially strong among women of color who have really been on the front lines of this pandemic in every possible way and need and deserve policy solutions that work for their families. So I will stop there, but thank you again for having me in this conversation, and I look forward to answering questions a little bit later.
Great. Thank you, Julie, and thank you for all the good work you're doing and making the point that Congress cannot leave families and kids behind. And now I will turn over to Anna and Emerald to talk about some of the work they've been doing for transition-age youth, and particularly around the tax credits. So thank you both for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much, First Focus, for having us here today. My name is Emerald Evans, a former foster youth and a youth advocate with John Burton Advocates for Youth. I'll be taking on the first end of the presentation, and then I'll pass it on to Anna as we conclude our presentation. So this year's tax year is like no other, and it is extremely important to ensure that all foster youth alumni and young adults experiencing homelessness are aware of the tax credits available to them and how to access free filing and support. We can go ahead to the next slide. For the first time ever, the EITC age qualification was actually lowered to 18 years old. Those who are 18 and older that have experienced foster care and or experiencing homelessness are qualified to receive a credit between $1,500 and about $6,700 based on their income and the number of children that they have. Another exciting federal law change is that the child tax credit for parents was increased to $3,600 per child for children 5 and under in 2021, and then $3,000 per child for children 6 to 17 in 2021 as well. Even if the parent was a minor, they can also file to get these credits. Another effective boost, to youth income came through stimulus checks during the pandemic. So some individuals that may have not received all 3 checks, even though they qualified, when filing their taxes, they should make sure that they request these stimulus checks that they did not receive. People can file up to 3 years of prior returns. So it is extremely worth it. And it's important that we educate our TAY youth to claim the things that they may have missed. JBay has a main page of resources. We have a TAY guide, a TAY checklist, fact sheet, and social media promotion. We will drop those in the chat for you, where you can access all of these documents that I will be previewing for you next. You can use the JBay's guide and checklist to help learn more about the credits yourself, learn the documents that they need, and then also how to file for free. So this guide is designed to help transition-age youth file their taxes and claim a cashback refund. The guide outlines information about tax laws, tax credits and deductions, tax filing requirement, documentation needed to file, and free tax preparation services. We also created a youth-friendly tax checklist that removes the tax filing jargon and walks youth through how to prepare to file for their taxes, what is needed, and where they can file for free. I found this resource extremely helpful to prepare to file my taxes, and also I shared this resource with other peers that may have also needed a better understanding on how to prepare for filing. It is written in very simple verbiage. It has images and easy to follow by the way that the document was formatted. This is literally an essential checklist that every TAY youth should have. So please make sure you check that out. We also have a social media toolkit for everyone who uses social media. This will help spread the word about these resources and the available tax credits and free filing strategies. Lastly, some TAY youth are not convinced to file. You may need to have a little bit more conversation with them. This fact sheet lists benefits to tax filing and helps foster youth understand why filing is worth the time now. I will now turn it over to Anna to tell you more.
Thank you, Emerald, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, at John Burton Advocates for Youth during the pandemic, we surveyed current and former foster youth and homeless youth, and many of them told us they had not received federal relief like the stimulus payments. So we worked with counties to better support them. Next slide. In 2020, Santa Clara County was our first pilot county, and they established a free tax site for foster youth last year. And at that site, it was kind of in response to the pandemic. They launched actually in March, so late in the tax season. And they were able to help 45 current and former foster youth receive over $135,000 in refunds and recovered stimulus payments. Parents experienced a 42% boost in their income. Single filers boosted their income by 14%, and the average return was over $2,800. So it made a big difference. Clearly, you can see. Next slide. We have a lot of information about the successes and findings from that first pilot in our report here, and a recorded webinar on that where you can learn more. Next slide. Because of the success of that pilot, Santa Clara County is working with us again this year, and we've expanded to 6 counties in California to establish volunteer income tax assistance sites dedicated to current and former foster youth with the support of the IRS and a number of funders. Next slide. Our early results as of tax day on April 18th was that so far 137 current and former foster youth did file through our sites. There's another 52 returns that are actively in progress. So far, a total of $367,898 in federal and state refunds are being issued to those young people. Only about $17,000 were owed from about 20 young people. And so far, our average return is $2,555. So this isn't pocket change. It's a big deal for our young people. Next slide. You can help us by directing transition age youth to a free service. Now, if they go to a paid service, we've experienced a lot of young people not maximizing their credits, misunderstanding that they have missed stimulus payments. So please help direct young people to a VITA site or a free tax appointment. And you can reach out and use these links to do so. We're open until at least June 30th, so there's still time to file. And I think we'll talk more during Q&A, but we'll hand it back. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. Lots of information there. So we're going to move into some questions, but I would be remiss if I didn't introduce my colleague, who I think was on screen at one point here, Avery Pakulis, who is the Vice President for Early Childhood and Public Health Policy, has been instrumental in putting today's discussion together. So thank you, Avery, for all your work, and please jump in with questions. But I wanted to take the floor here with a general question for all of you. So we've heard a lot. The American Rescue Plan and other quick action by the federal government helped to address material hardship, kind of close the gap between households with and without children. We've heard that the recovery, though, is unfortunately uneven. There's more work to do. We heard from Emerald and Anna that they, put together a lot of resources and did, excellent outreach to ensure transition age youth know about the cash benefits and the tax credits, and actually had the support to file and receive them. And like Anna just said, if the average credit was over $2,000, that is not pocket change. That's good money. And so I guess I would pose this question to all of you to answer, and Avery, you can answer too if you want. But if you had like a 30-second elevator ride with your U.S. senator or representative, what would your message be to them now, as we're sort of stalled a little bit in Congress and people are getting a little frustrated that we can't get through the legislation to help families and our economy? We're not giving up. We're going to keep going and ensuring that kids and families are a priority here. But what would your sort of 30-second elevator speech be if you had the moment to chat with them? Patrick, Sam, you guys want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. This probably won't be a surprise based on some of our writing and the work that our faculty director Luke Schaefer has done in support of the child tax credit over the years. But Ezra Klein had a great article on this. I think it was in the Sunday Times this last week. It was basically saying that we had finally sort of done it with the expanded child tax credit, where we had aligned ourselves with most other wealthy developed nations in putting in place some sort of a universal child allowance that wasn't based on any sort of earnings threshold, which had kept many families from accessing the expanded child tax credit. And then we saw in the data that it did what it was supposed to do. It significantly cut child poverty. It significantly cut hardship. So we had finally made this tremendous kind of dent in child poverty in America, and then we just stopped. So that's right. That's the one thing when you look at all the things that we should be doing. That seems the piece that's most obvious that we have to get done.
Thank you. Sam, did you have something to add, or should I turn over to Julie?
I'll just add that, yeah, exactly. That I echo Pat that expanding the child tax credit is paramount. And as we found in our data, that the concerns about inflation, child tax credit leading to increased inflation, is really not the case here. We're seeing that even after adjusting for inflation, families, especially low-income households with children, are actually had bank balances that were over 50% more than what they were in 2019. So I just echo our research that we found that, yeah, child tax credit, reestablishing the child tax credit is the way to go.
And thank you for bringing up the inflation piece again, because that is, like you said, getting top headlines these days. So it's good to hear that. Julie, looking for your comments.
Sure. So I think I'm gonna cheat a little bit and talk about more than one policy, but we'll still try to keep it very brief. I mean, I think what I would want to emphasize is that women in the United States have been breadwinners and caregivers for their families for decades, and we have still been working in sort of an economy and workplace structures that are built for women to only be one or the other. That's not our reality. It hasn't been for a long time, and the pandemic really exposed and exacerbated the challenges that women are facing in trying to do both. And if we don't finally invest in the care infrastructure that we need for all people, but especially for women and women of color who have been disproportionately bearing these responsibilities for so long, our economy and our families will suffer. So we need to ensure that every family can access high quality, affordable childcare, and that childcare workers, who are also mostly women and disproportionately women of color, get paid a living wage or more than a living wage to do that essential work. And we also need universal free pre-K. We need paid family and medical leave for everyone in the workforce. We need to invest in home and community-based services so that families can ensure that their loved ones who are aging or managing disabilities are cared for. And we need to continue that expanded child tax credit. So I will stop there, but care infrastructure investments are the thing that we cannot give up on.
Thank you for that very much. Emerald and Anna, what are your thoughts? In the elevator.
Yeah, in the elevator. It's called relief for a reason, because people are suffering. 18 to 24-year-olds, our transition age youth, experience the highest rates of unemployment. It's going to take them longer to get back in the workforce. And they're going to have years where they need to recover that lost income. We have surveys and surveys showing this. The report I told you about shows that their former foster youth, they're making $16,000 a year in California. To do this and to make it permanent is the minimum. We can do more to make sure that they fully recover, and we owe them that. So that is my true elevator pitch. Make it permanent. It's the least we can do. They need it. And every time I file someone's taxes with them, they do have that wave of relief, and they go and pay off their debts. they go and buy food for their kids, they fix their cars so they can go to work. And that's what I see every day. And I don't want to see this next year when these don't exist, if they don't be made permanent. We need this, and we need this for ongoing to recover.
Thank you for that. Emerald, did you have comments to?
Yeah, I would second Anna. It's definitely something that has made an impact this tax season. And so to hopefully see something permanent is definitely needed, especially here in California, you know, and just hearing the inflation, being a part of the inflation and being a former foster youth in these climates, you know, our family dynamics are not the same, support's not the same. We see it throughout just amongst my peers and things. So definitely will be pushing for the permanency of that. And so definitely seconding Anna's statement.
Well, thank you all for those great responses to that. And, you know, at First Focus, we've really been fighting to ensure that kids are a priority and that we invest in them as our federal lawmakers make key decisions. And we're going to keep pushing to see that we get the legislation through that is broad, meaningful, and addresses all the different issues we've heard you talk about today. I'm going to just pause a little bit. Avery, did you have any follow-up questions that you wanted to put out there, or are there some in the chat from the audience at this
There are
point?
a couple in the chat, Michelle.
Okay.
Specifically on childcare. So Julie may be best suited to answer some of these, but there's a question about partnering with organized labor and if that's happening. Julie, I know that the National Women's Law Center has a campaign that it's running. I don't know if that's what you'd want to talk about here, but it could make sense to mention that and anything else that you think of.
Sorry, just making sure I'm actually unmuted this time. So I'm so glad you asked about this. And we have partnered with SEIU in particular on our childcare work to, again, ensure that our approach to childcare is not focused solely on expanding access and making childcare more affordable for families, but also ensuring that childcare workers have the wages and benefits and honestly the respect that they deserve. I mean, the way that the women who work in childcare have been expected to hold up our economy through a pandemic, often putting their own health on the line for $10 or $11 or $12 an hour, just so perfectly encapsulates, I think, how we undervalue so much of the work that women do in this country, especially the work that Black women and immigrant women and women of color do. We actually interviewed one childcare provider in our qualitative research, and she told us how stressful the job is and how we are totally underpaid for the work that we do, and how she doesn't see any men who are men who are working in childcare. And she's exactly right. So at the Law Center, we actually launched last year a campaign called We Are the Backbone, to uplift the stories and actually the faces of the childcare workers who are essential to make all other work possible. So I will put a link in the chat in a second so you can see how we shared their images and stories actually on big billboards in Chicago and in Times Square in New York City. But really the key takeaway is what we need to do about this, which is to finally treat childcare like the public good that it is and invest in it accordingly, so that childcare jobs can be good jobs, can be unionized jobs, can be jobs that pay fair wages and have good benefits without costing families more, and grow this sector so that every family who needs it can access high quality, affordable childcare, and women and our economy can thrive.
Thank you for that. I have a follow-up question for Anna and Emerald, but Avery, if there was another one in the chat.
There was one more, Julie, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but this talks about the need to give some for tax reform to give to incentivize employers to provide childcare. Now, I don't think we can solve our childcare crisis by relying on employers, but are they a piece of the puzzle here as well?
So we are certainly supportive of any employer who honestly recognizes that it is in their own self-interest to support childcare and help their workers access it. That is a win-win for employers and employees. That said, again, I think that's a small piece and not a solution. It's a solution, or in the past, it has been framed as a solution when really it's just another, in our view, kind of Band-Aid that can sometimes distract from what actually is the solution, which is the kind of really substantial federal investments that we need to ensure access is available for everyone and not just on an employer by employer basis.
Thank you for that. And I think Senator Casey's remarks were right in line with that. Anna and Emerald, I know there's some good news coming out of California on the tax front. So I was hoping you might share that and just how you all have been involved to kind of move the ball in a good direction out in California.
Absolutely. California Governor Gavin Newsom, the State Controller Betty Yee, Senator Ana Caballero are all championing a budget item that would provide a $1,000 tax credit to current and former foster youth 18 through age 25 when they file their taxes and when they qualify for the California Earned Income Tax Credit. So recognizing that they're living in deep poverty, that they've lost work throughout the pandemic, and this would be an ongoing budget ask to support our state's children who have aged out of care. That would be for anyone who was in care on or after their age 13th birthday. So that could impact 77,000 California current and former foster youth every year.
That's great news. Thank you. Well, we're approaching top of the hour here, so I think we will wrap up. I hope that those of you who were listening in learned some good information to share with your lawmakers, and I appreciate all the work our panelists are doing, my colleagues who helped put this all together. We have more work to do, but I think together we can keep fighting to get it done and ensure that our children are not living in poverty and that we address the needs of all families. So thank you very much for today. Take good care.